This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so welcome to your lecture on the nervous system. I hope that everybody should by now have read the material so that you'll be able to understand what I'm going to discuss with the nervous system. So we will get started. I am still recovering from being sick, so if you hear me cough or whatnot, I'll try to be careful, but just so you're aware, I am not as great as I wish I would be. So, when we're looking at the nervous system, you want to understand that there's two main divisions of the nervous system. You have your central nervous system, which is the first main division. We say CNS. So you'll hear me say CNS later on in lectures. I'm referring to the central nervous system. Now, the CNS contains the brain and spinal cord. So this is central to us. So if you imagine yourself standing up, you have your brain, your spinal cord, which goes down the center of your body. That's how you can remember central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, or PNS, are is everything to the periphery. So if you think of peripheral vision, if you're driving or you're walking and somebody says, "Oh, I saw that through my peripheral vision," it's on the outside, right? So the same thing, the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, are the outer parts. So, for example, the nerves that go to and from the brain and spinal cord. So, the central nervous system is going to be your brain and spinal cord. However, the peripheral nervous system are going to be the nerves that go to and from the brain and spinal cord. So, some of those examples of those nerves are your cranial nerves, which we'll talk about uh, several lectures down the road, and also your spinal nerves. So, again, two main divisions. You have your central nervous system, or your CNS, which is your brain and spinal cord, and then you have your peripheral nervous system, which are the nerves that go to and from the brain and spinal cord, or you can think to and from the CNS. Now, the somatic nervous system is another main division. We have our somatic nervous system, which sends and receives sensory messages that control voluntary motor movement. So, voluntary is the key piece here. So, the somatic nervous system sends and receives sensory messages, things like vision that tell us to voluntarily move, or sound that says, "Hey, I want you to go and turn off the lights." That is sound coming in, or sensory saying, "Okay, I'm going to go now and turn off the lights." So, voluntary movement. Now, with the autonomic nervous system, and again, these are part of the peripheral nervous system, you want to think automatic. So, the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, we are going to think automatic. This is involuntary movement, or automatic. So, for example, when we were talking about, going back a slide, for the two main divisions of the PNS, the first being the somatic nervous system, that is going to send and receive sensory messages for voluntary movement. The second main division of the PNS is the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, and you're going to think automatic. So this is going to be automatic or involuntary movements. So these are going to be things like respiration, your muscle movement that's involuntary. So, like heart muscle, right? Glands, digestion, so stomach, heart rate, metabolism. These are things that are automatic. They're involuntary movements. Okay. The major function of the autonomic nervous system is homeostasis. It's to make sure that we stay at homeostasis. So our metabolism has to stay at a certain rate. If it doesn't and it shifts and it's too high, then everything's going to speed up. If it's too low, everything's going to slow down. So the goal is to maintain this central level or homeostasis, an average level. So again, autonomic nervous system, automatic, involuntary. These are going to be certain muscles like heart muscle, which control helps with the heart rate, metabolism, glands, respiration, digestion. So these are things. Now, some people say, yes, you can control your respiration. I can hold my breath. Yes, you can. But if you pass out, you're automatically going to start breathing again. So, for example, if I sit here and I go, okay, I'm going to hold my breath. I can hold my breath, cut off respiration. The minute that I pass out and become unconscious, I'm automatically going to start respirating again. So it's technically involuntary. Now, there's two main divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So before I go there, I'm going to review again so that I make it real clear. In general, we have the nervous system, right? So we have two main divisions of the nervous system as a whole. We have the central nervous system, or the CNS, which is the brain and spinal cord. The second piece of the overarching nervous system that we can have division is the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS. And those are going to be our nerves that go to and from the brain and spinal cord, such as the cranial nerves and the spinal cord, or spinal nerves, excuse me. So now we look at, well, let's just look at the peripheral nervous system. The peripheral nervous system has two main divisions, right? The somatic nervous system, so that's our voluntary motor movement, and then the autonomic nervous system, automatic, okay? Now within the autonomic nervous system, we have two more divisions. So the first is sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight. It controls stress, and there is a stress hormone that we have called cortisol. What cortisol does is it allows us to go, go, go. So this is why many people after the semester, or when they've worked so much and then they're going on vacation, many people get sick because cortisol, while we're under stress, while we're studying, while we're going to classes, while we're working, we're go, go, go. So we are in our sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, going, going, going. And that cortisol allows us to continue going. It prevents us from getting sick as well. So if we have high levels of cortisol, that's going to be protective of sickness. Then we go on vacation. So say the class semester ends and now we're like, oh, thank God. I can finally rest. I don't need to study. I don't need to read. I don't need to do any academics. And then you find yourself getting sick. That's because your cortisol level dropped. And so now it spikes low because we were high, 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 and we went low. So the goal would be to keep our cortisol levels at homeostasis by balancing and keeping our sympathetic nervous system at bay. And we'll talk about later on in lectures how we do that. So the first main division, again, of the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, is the sympathetic nervous system. This is our fight or flight. What happens in fight or flight? Well, we have increased heart rate. We have increased respiration. We have increased blood pressure. So if you imagine yourself being chased by somebody, you're running, 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 right? That is fight or flight. Your sympathetic nervous system is kicked in. So if you're trying to run from somebody who's chasing you, your heart rate's going to increase, your respiration or your breathing is going to increase, your blood pressure is going to increase. But one of the things that's going to decrease is digestion and elimination. Elimination being defecation or urination, that's going to decrease because we want to pull from those resources. We want to pull from the GI system so that we can have more energy to run, which is going to help, you know, elevate that heart rate, the respiration, blood pressure. The best way to remember this is if you are being chased by a bear, you don't want to poop yourself, right? So you're being chased by a bear, your heart rate's up, your respiration's up, your blood pressure's up, your digestion and your elimination is going to be down because we don't want to poop or pee ourselves when we're running from a bear, right? So that is how you can remember the sympathetic nervous system. On the other hand, the second main component of the autonomic nervous system, or ANS, is the parasympathetic nervous system. The goal of the parasympathetic nervous system is to bring us back to homeostasis, bring us back where we were, because we cannot stay in fight or flight or in the sympathetic nervous system for too long. We'll break down. So, what does that look like? The opposite of what we see with our sympathetic. So our blood pressure is now going to decrease. Our heart rate is going to come back to normal. We're going to decrease our respiration. And now we will increase our digestion again and our elimination. So the goal of parasympathetic nervous system is to kick in to bring us back down from sympathetic arousal. So hopefully that makes sense. One way to think about this, and I'll talk about this later on in future lectures, but if you think of your car, the gas pedal is our sympathetic nervous system. So we jam on the gas pedal, we're going to go, 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 right? The brake of the car is to slow us down, to bring us back to the average speed. So that's going to return us back to homeostasis. That is the parasympathetic nervous system. So the gas in the car, the gas pedal itself is our sympathetic nervous system. We press on that to go. The brake we press on to slow down in the car. That's the same thing with the peripheral nervous system. Underneath the autonomic, we have our gas, which is going to be the sympathetic, and the brake pedal, which is going to be the parasympathetic nervous system. So I mentioned this here with biofeedback. I'm going to talk about that later under treatments, but the premise is the gas brake. So for biofeedback, we're trying to balance that gas brake, the sympathetic, parasympathetic. But you don't have to worry about biofeedback right now because we'll talk about that when I get through that section. Now, this is important to know because when we talk about neurons or information, and I know you read this in your in the assigned reading, when we're looking at the central nervous system. Okay, so we just talked about the PNS or peripheral nervous system. Now we're going to spend a little time on the central nervous system. Again, CNS is the brain and spinal cord. But when we're talking about neurons are nerve cells. And I'm going to have a separate lecture on this as well. But the one thing I want to make sure that I cover right now is that sensory or afferent neurons carry information from the body to the central nervous system. The sensory or afferent neurons carry information to the brain and spinal cord or to the CNS. So if you think of how you can remember this, is think about your senses. So if I want to process something that I see, which is a sense, vision, I see something, I want my brain to process it. I want to carry that info to my brain then that is sensory or afferent neurons. I want you to know both of those terms. So make a note card if you need to, so that you know that sensory are afferent neurons, because it's likely I will ask that question on a quiz. Now, motor neurons, if you think of motor, think of movement, or efferent neurons with an E. We are taking information from the CNS and bringing it to the muscle or glands. So if we want to move, so say I want to move my arm, I am going to be using motor or efferent neurons. So I'm going to take information away from my brain and spinal cord to the muscles or glands so that I move. Many people get these two afferent sensory motor mixed up. So make sure you make yourself a little note card if you can, if you want, that has sensory on one side, afferent on the other, motor on another card, efferent on the other, and know what they do. So if I say something like information that is taken from the CNS and sent to muscles, are known as, know that it's either, the answer is either going to be motor or efferent. Okay. Now, the major divisions of the brain, we're not going to go so detailed because you're not going to remember everything. I want you to get, by the end of this course, a good understanding of the main things. Because if we get too detailed, it's very complicated, and it's not, you don't need to know it in that detail. You can move on to a master's in neurology or biology or something to get the really, really details. But I want you to just understand the basics. So again, we're still in the central nervous system because we're talking about the brain. So the major divisions of the brain, the cerebrum. The cerebrum consists of your cerebral cortex and the subcortical areas. So subcortical, sub means underneath, right? Like submarine, underwater or below water. Subcortical, right? So I want you to think of a grapefruit or even an orange, okay? When I talk about first the cerebral cortex. That rind, that hard part of a grapefruit or an orange, think of the grapefruit or the orange as your brain. And the rind, the hard part on the outside, that part is your cerebral cortex. That's the outer layer of the cerebrum. Okay? So the cerebrum is, let's say, the entire orange or grapefruit. The cerebral cortex is that outer layer, that hard part, to protect what's underneath it, or the subcortical areas. Okay? The cerebral cortex, or the brain, isn't fully developed at birth. A lot of people think it is. The brain isn't fully developed until the age of 24. Specifically, the frontal lobe is the last to develop. So many of you, your brains are still developing. Now, one thing you want to know about the cerebral cortex is that the brain is divided into two hemispheres and four lobes. The two hemispheres are going to be your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. So you hear people that talk about, oh, that person's left-brained or right-brained. They're talking about the hemisphere. So when we look at the two hemispheres, we're looking at the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. So it's right down the middle, that you go down the middle of your brain, and everything on the left is your left hemisphere. Everything on the right is your right hemisphere. The left hemisphere we'll talk about for a minute first. The left, I want you to remember left language. The left side of your brain, the left hemisphere, is very big with language. So when there's damage, we often see language issues. So left hemisphere or left part of the brain is big with language, logic, rational thinking or rationality, abstract thinking, analytical thinking, logic. Again, the left, you can think language, logic, it's your analytical side, your rational side, the abstract thinking. All of that is left hemisphere. Okay. The other hemisphere is the right hemisphere. This is the emotion area. This is music, art, creativity, intuition, perceptual understandings. So, how we perceive things, colors, that sort of thing. This is all right hemisphere. Spatial, organ, like that type of thing. So, right hemisphere, very creative. It's the creative part of the brain, music, art, emotion, perception, spatial, again, intuition. All of this is right hemisphere. Now, with the lobes, so again, cerebral cortex, your brain is divided into two hemispheres. So if you cut your brain right down the middle, from back to front or front to back, on the left side of your brain is going to be language, it's going to be logic, it's going to be analytical, it's going to be all of that. The right side, however, as you see, is going to be perceptual, emotion, music, art, intuition. Then with the brain, we have four lobes. So each of the lobes will have both a left and a right hemisphere. So, for example, we'll start off with the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe is the frontal part of your brain. This part of the brain, and you'll see this in your textbook, and you'll see it in the photos in the textbook as well. So this is where your personality is developed, your emotionality, your inhibition, your planning, organizing, abstract thinking, judgment, intuition, initiation. This is our higher executive functioning. So to give you an example, the frontal lobe, you'll see emotionality, right? Well, that's also the right hemisphere, right? So emotionality would be the right frontal lobe, right? So if you cut your brain in half if you go from the middle, uh, right down the middle, from front to back, you have your left side of your brain and your right side of your brain. If I said which part of the frontal lobe is involved with emotionality, because the right hemisphere has to do with emotionality, you're going to know it's the right frontal lobe, right? Whereas when you see abstract thinking, if I said what part of the frontal lobe is abstract thinking, you're going to know that it's the left frontal lobe, right? Because the left hemisphere is abstract thinking. So make sure you look up in your textbooks, if you haven't read yet, look at the brain and you'll see this. There's pictures of it. Now, the Broca's area are the muscles that control speech. So, as you're thinking right now, and if I say, okay, I want you to say the sentence, I love Dr. DeFeo's class. Okay. And you think, and then you say it. You are able to produce that speech or to say it because of your Broca's area. Remember, the left hemisphere has to do with language. So the Broca's area is located in the left frontal lobe because it controls the muscles that produce speech. Now, The parietal lobes, as you'll see in your textbook as well, they're on top. So if you take your hands right now and put it on the top of your head and you press down just a little bit, you'll notice that you feel touch, you feel some pressure, right? That's your parietal lobes. So the parietal lobes, you have the right and the left, they are your primary sensory area. So what does this mean? Well, those lobes are very much involved with touch, pain, heat, proprioception. The term proprioception has to do with the ability to locate your body parts. Now, this sounds funny, but for people who have issues with or damage to their parietal lobes, they'll have issues with this. So if I said to you right now, I want you to close your eyes, I want you to take your right index finger and touch your nose. When you do that, you are able to locate your body part, right? I hope you all did. If not, you may want to go see a neurologist. Okay, so you close your eyes and I say, touch your nose. You touch your nose. If you touched your mouth instead of your nose, then that would be a difficulty with proprioception. So proprioception is the ability to locate your body part. Now, with the occipital lobe in the back, this is in the back of the brain. So, how I've been teaching this course for about, let's see, it's been about 12 years now. And I use the same thing to describe this. So, say somebody comes behind you and they smack you in the back of the head. What are you going to see? Stars, right? So, the occipital lobe, you can remember, is in the back of the brain. It's the back part of your brain. You have the right and left side. And it's where the primary visual cortex is located. That's all I want you to know about it, because later on, when we talk about cranial nerves, it's going to make sense. You're going to see this in more detail. But right now, I just want you to know the occipital lobe in the back of your brain, that's the back part of your brain, houses the primary visual cortex. And how you're going to remember it is if I come up and go smack in the back of your head, you're going to see stars, primary visual cortex. Okay? The temporal lobes are on the sides, right above your ears. Okay, both sides. This houses the primary auditory cortex. So, how you're going to remember this is it's right by your ears. And in order for you to hear, you need those temporal lobes. Okay, so that's how you remember it. It's also big with emotional behavior and memory. Now, when we're looking at the Wernicke's area is very big with interpreting language. So the Wernicke's area is located in the temporal lobe, and you're going to know that it's the left side because it interprets language, and the left hemisphere is big with language, right? So, for example, if somebody has Wernicke's aphasia, that is some sort of lesion or damage to the Wernicke's area. And I'll post some videos so you all can see this later on. We're going to get into aphasias and all that, so you don't need to know it now, and you'll see some video examples of this. But just to give you an idea, Wernicke's area, if they have aphasia, what that means is they will be able to understand or what they're trying to tell you, but they won't make sense. So, say for example, and they have difficulty with comprehending as well. So, for example, I may say 2 keys and good night and TV. That makes no sense. That's exactly what they will do with Wernicke's aphasia. They believe that they're making sense, but they don't. It's called word salad because it's just random words put together. But they believe that they're making sense if they have Wernicke's aphasia. But again, we'll talk about that um, later on when we talk about damage to the brain in future lectures. Now, the subcortical areas. So remember, the grapefruit, cortical, the outside, the nice rind part. We divide the brain into 4 lobes: the frontal, the temporal, the occipital, the parietal. Now, the gushy stuff. The stuff that's underneath that rind that's in our orange or our grapefruit. Those are our subcortical areas. So one of the big subcortical areas is your corpus callosum, and you'll see an image of this as well in your textbook. But it's a bundle. It goes right down the center of your brain. So it actually is the divider of the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. It's this bundle of fibers that bridges so that the left and the right hemisphere can talk, can communicate with each other. Now, the interesting thing is that there's crossings, and you'll see this with when I talk about cranial nerves. But when we take in information in one side, so say I take in information from my right eye, my left part of my brain is actually processing it. If I take in information from my left eye, my right eye is actually processing it. I'll explain why. You don't need to know that right now, but I'll explain why when we talk about cranial nerves. It'll make more sense. So the corpus callosum, what you want to know about that is it bridges the left and right hemisphere. It allows them to communicate. Now, the thalamus. The thalamus is the major relay station for all senses. So, what are your senses? In general, your senses are vision, taste, smell, hearing, and touch, right? So, the thalamus is the major relay station for all senses except smell or olfaction. What's called olfaction means smell. So, for example, all of those, so your vision, your hearing, your touch, your taste, those 4, in order for us to process those, everything has to pass through the thalamus. The only thing that does not pass through the thalamus on the senses is smell or olfaction. Okay? The hypothalamus is another subcortical area, very big. You're going to remember this by what I'm going to talk about, the 5 F's. So with hypothalamus, the job of the hypothalamus is to maintain homeostasis, temperature regulation. It regulates hunger, thirst, sex, aggression, the sleep-wake cycle. So how you'll remember this are the 5 F's, okay? The first F is fever, so temperature regulation. The second F is feeding, so you could think about hunger, thirst. The third F, fighting, so you can think about aggression. The fourth F, falling asleep or the sleep-wake cycle. The fifth F, fornicating. I know you were going to use a different word. And if that's how you remember it, go for it. But the fifth word or the fifth F is fornicating or sex. So remember the 5 F's to remember the hypothalamus. Now, here they are: feeding, fighting, fever, falling asleep, fornicating. Okay. The pituitary. The pituitary is the master endocrine gland. The pituitary part of the brain, master endocrine gland. And this is because it releases hormones that influence all the other endocrine glands. So, growth, the thyroid is an endocrine gland, the parathyroid is an endocrine gland, the ovaries, testes, those are endocrine glands, the pancreas, the adrenal cortex. So, the pituitary is the master endocrine gland. It releases hormones that influence all these other glands. You don't need to know this, right? Well, you need to know this part, the master endocrine gland, that it helps to or releases hormones that influence all these other endocrine glands. But you don't need to know what the thyroid is yet, or the parathyroid, or you don't need to know all of that yet. But what I want you to know is about the pituitary in general. Later on, we'll get into what the thyroid does, what the parathyroid does, etc. Okay? The limbic system. The limbic system is very big with emotional behavior, aggression, um, helps control and work with the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the septum. So all of these parts are part of the limbic system, and we'll get into these parts a lot throughout this course. But the limbic system, very big with emotional behavior and aggression. So some of the parts are the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the septum. For example, the septum, one of the things they found is in monkeys when they were doing research, that when they severed the septum in monkeys, they went into what they call a septal rage. And what happened is these monkeys became very aggressive, very, very aggressive. They had like extensive sexual behaviors, very aggressive, emotional. Um, they so septal rage, they were able to figure out by severing that part of the septum of these monkeys, and they found that. And so if somebody does ever experience a human any type of damage to the septum, they could experience a septal rage. So other brain areas that I want you to be familiar with, the cerebellum. The cerebellum's at the bottom of the brain. You'll see that in your textbook. Very big with balance and coordination. And the brainstem. Brainstem, if we cut the brainstem, you die because it's very big with controlling your cardiovascular activity, it's facial expressions. So part of the brainstem are your pons and medulla oblongata. So with the brainstem, very big. You cut this, you're gonna die because it will cut off your cardiovascular activity. And you'll see that in the book as well. So, the last part that I'm going to talk about in this lecture is going to be the spinal cord. With the spinal cord, you have four regions of the spinal cord. You have your cervical area, which is the top part that goes up the top of the neck. So, the cervical is right there at the top of your neck that connects to the base of your brain. So the cervical there's seven of them. So C1 through C7. Whenever we're looking at different areas of spinal cord injuries, you'll hear them say, oh, they have a bulging disc at L1, L2, or L5S1, or they have a sever at T1, T2. The reason why they do that is so that individuals in the medical field can understand where there's damage or where things are. So the cervical area has seven, so C1 through C7. Then the thoracic, if you go down to the next part, you're going lower. So the thoracic is going to be, there's 12 of them, so T1 through T12. Then the lumbar, which is the lower back area, that's L1 through L5. Most injuries that people suffer are the lumbar area. And you could also think of a lumberjack. So they cut wood, they have to use that lower back. So lumbar is lower, sacral, you want to keep your butt in check. You want to keep your butt in check, right? You want to keep it sacred so that you can go to heaven, right? So sacral, S1. So there's only one of them. So we have C1 through C7, which is all the way at the top. Then through your chest area in the back of the spinal cord, we have our T1 through T12. Then the lumbar, which is the lower back, that's L1, L5 to L5. And then sacral is your butt bone, and that is S1. For somebody that has quadriplegic, or they are paralyzed in all four limbs, the sever has to be above. So if somebody gets severed, their spinal cord gets severed, wherever that sever is, down is where they'll be paralyzed. So if they are in the C1 through C5 section, that they sever that, they will be paralyzed in all four limbs. That's quadriplegia, quad meaning four. Paraplegia would be if there's a sever C6 or lower. So that's going to be like paralyzed from the waist down, essentially. And then paresis or weakness. Paresis means weakness. So if they go around C6, C7, there could be weakness as well. So, but again, C6 down, they will have paraplegia. So, let's see. So that is all I want to go into now. The next lecture, I'm going to go into the neurons and neurotransmitters and all that. But for now, I just want you to get the piece on the spinal cord and the main brain and the different divisions and all that. So make sure that you rewatch anything of this lecture. Make sure you take good notes. And you will need to study this for the quiz, and know the main pieces, know the main things. And I wish you good luck. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Other than that, that is our conclusion of this lecture. So I hope you enjoyed your time, and I look forward to future lectures with you. Okay.